Forget the Hollywood lies. The real Wild West was painted in blood. What if the greatest legend of the frontier wasn't a hero, but a monster to the law and a savior to the starving? They called him a ruthless killer, but history buried the heartbreaking truth of why he fired that first shot. So, how does an innocent man lose everything and become America's most feared outlaw? And what chilling secret did he take to the gallows? This is not a fairy tale. This is hell on earth. You have been fed a cinematic illusion, a polished myth of glorious shootouts under the blazing high noon sun, where the righteous lawman and the honorable outlaw face off in a test of pure speed. The horrifying truth is that stepping outside the bounds of frontier justice was not a romantic adventure. It was a bloody death sentence, a one-way ticket to a dark, suffocating dungeon of your own making. If it were you, you wouldn't survive 24 hours in this lawless territory. The frontier was a brutal wasteland where human morality was completely devoured by the harsh elements and the desperate, primal urge to simply see another sunrise. Let us tear apart the polished myths and expose the rotting core of what it truly meant to be a wanted man in the 19th century American West. Historical records reveal a truth so ruthless, it will shatter your perception of the era. Over 90% of all homicides in the wild frontier were not face-to-face duels of honor. They were cowardly, blood-soaked ambushes. They were cold-blooded assassinations in the pitch-black darkness. An outlaw did not stand in the dusty street calling out his enemy. He waited in the suffocating darkness of a muddy alleyway, the putrid stench of raw sewage and human feces filling his lungs. He hid behind the swinging wooden doors of a stinking saloon, his heavy Winchester rifle leveled at the back of an unsuspecting head. When the lead bullets rained down, there was no honor, only the chilling sound of a skull shattering, the sickening spray of dark blood, and the heavy thud of a lifeless corpse hitting the dirt. Consider the reality of the man who fired that first shot, not out of malice, but out of absolute, starving desperation. The system was rigged, corrupt to its very core by greedy railroad barons and merciless land grabbers. A desperate farmer, watching his family slowly wither away from starvation, is pushed to the absolute brink. He picks up his six-shooter to take back what was stolen from him. In that single, bloody moment, the law brands him a monster. He is no longer a man, he is a bounty, a walking bag of gold coins waiting to be claimed. This is the true nature of the outlaw life. It is not freedom, it is a life completely paralyzed by a terrifying, bone-chilling paranoia that slowly suffocates your sanity. Imagine the crushing psychological torture of knowing that every single stranger you cross paths with could be the executioner sent to measure you for a pine box. There was no glory to be found when you were constantly looking over your shoulder. You never slept deeply. You closed your eyes in a state of agonizing hypervigilance, one eye always half open, your sweating hand permanently curled around the cold grip of your revolver. The slightest noise, the howling of the relentless desert wind, a stray dog knocking over a barrel, or the creak of wooden floorboards in a cheap, rotting boarding house would send a violent jolt of pure, unadulterated terror through your veins. You were a hunted animal, condemned to wander the darkest corners of the earth. The supposed freedom that drew men to the lawless territory was a cruel, deadly trap. They fled the industrializing East, seeking wide-open spaces and a life without crushing rules. But when you become an outlaw, the entire world instantly transforms into an inescapable nightmare. You cannot enter a bustling frontier settlement without scanning the rooftops for a hidden sniper. You cannot enjoy a hot, simple meal without positioning your back against a solid brick wall, your eyes darting at every shadow. You are permanently trapped in an endless cycle of brutal violence and desperate flight. The blazing, merciless sun beats down on your exhausted body as you ride across the barren, unforgiving landscape. Your throat burns with a severe thirst that cannot be quenched by the murky, disease-ridden water of the rare desert watering holes. You are totally isolated, cut off from civilized society, forced to rely only on a gang of ruthless cutthroats who would just as easily put a lead bullet in your spine if it meant saving their own miserable skin or claiming a larger share of the stolen loot. The romanticized camaraderie among thieves is a fatal lie. When the chips are down and the heavily armed posse is closing in, the raw, brutal survival instinct takes over completely. The outlaw life is an existence entirely defined by betrayal, extreme physical exhaustion, and the ever-present, terrifying shadow of the hangman's noose. Every stolen dollar, every hijacked train, brings you one step closer to the bloody gallows. The air in the frontier was thick with the smell of death and gunpowder. You were not a hero riding into the sunset. You were a desperate fugitive, covered in a thick layer of filth, your clothes stiff with dried sweat and the dark blood of your enemies. The constant exposure to the elements began to physically tear you apart. In the freezing winters, frostbite would turn your fingers black, the flesh slowly dying and rotting away while you still needed them to pull the trigger. In the scorching summers, the relentless heat would bake the land, turning every day into an agonizing struggle just to breathe the suffocating, dusty air. The legend of the outlaw is a magnificent lie constructed by dime novels. The reality is a horrifying tale of physical decay, mental torture, and a soul slowly being crushed by the immense, unforgiving weight of the lawless territory. There was no salvation waiting at the end of the trail, only the cold, hard earth, ready to swallow your forgotten corpse, taking your chilling secrets down into the dark abyss. If you believe that successfully robbing a Union Pacific train instantly granted you a life of luxury, filled with beautiful women in velvet dresses and endless rivers of fine wine, you are gravely mistaken. Take a deep breath of this rotting stench and let the horrifying truth sink in. The Hollywood depiction of the frontier saloon is a dangerous, polished fantasy. They show you shining mahogany bars, cheerful piano music, and high-stakes poker games where honorable men test their luck and skill. The medieval reality of a frontier watering hole was an absolute nightmare, a literal hell on earth that served as a squalid breeding ground for death, disease, and bottomless human despair. Step through those iconic swinging wooden doors, and you would not be greeted by the warm, inviting glow of a welcoming hearth. You would be immediately assaulted by a foul, suffocating odor that could make a hardened, grown man violently ill. The floors of these lawless establishments were rarely made of clean, swept wood. They were packed dirt, heavily soaked and permanently stained with a vile, slippery mixture of spilled cheap liquor, thick brown mud, stagnant water, animal blood, and raw human feces. There was absolutely no sanitation, no clean running water, and no escape from the relentless, maddening swarm of flies that fed on the rotting filth in the corners. This was the dark, miserable dungeon where the supposedly glamorous outlaws were forced to hide like frightened rats. You might have thousands of stolen dollars burning a hole in your heavy leather saddlebags, but that bloody wealth was entirely useless when you were a wanted man with a price on your head. You could not simply ride into a civilized eastern city, buy a tailored suit, and check into a grand hotel. You were permanently condemned to the shadows, forced to seek temporary refuge in these stinking, disease-ridden rat nests on the very bleeding edge of the map. And the poison they served in these establishments was just as lethal as a heavy lead bullet from a Winchester rifle. The whiskey of the Wild West was not carefully aged in oak barrels for years. It was a toxic, homemade concoction explicitly designed to paralyze your nervous system and numb the crushing, unbearable despair of frontier life. Corrupt bartenders routinely mixed pure industrial grain alcohol with dirty, brown river water, adding chewing tobacco, burnt sugar, harsh ammonia, and even raw gunpowder to give the foul liquid a brutal, burning kick. They called it tarantula juice or coffin varnish for a very good, very literal reason. Drinking it felt like swallowing liquid fire, a searing sensation that slowly tore apart your stomach lining and systematically rotted your internal organs. Every single glass you drank brought you one step closer to a painful, agonizing death. But the outlaws drank it anyway in massive quantities, desperately trying to drown out the haunting, nightly screams of the men they had killed, and the constant, chilling fear of the ruthless bounty hunters slowly closing in on their trail. This was the tragic, inescapable irony of the outlaw existence. You risked your life, shed innocent blood, and damned your eternal soul to steal a fortune, only to find yourself eternally trapped in a squalid, suffocating sewer, unable to spend a single silver dime without risking the hangman's noose. And the physical environment was only half of the terror. These isolated saloons were epicenters of horrific, unstoppable plagues. Cholera swept through these lawless towns like a merciless grim reaper, turning once strong men into hollow, severely dehydrated husks who vomited dark liquid and died screaming in unbearable agony on the muddy, filth-covered floor. Syphilis ran rampant among the desperate populations. A silent, invisible assassin that slowly devoured the brain and rotted the flesh over years of silent, shameful torture. There was no romanticized love or gentle affection to be found in the arms of the saloon girls. It was a bleak, purely transactional exchange in a pitch-black, suffocating room, a desperate attempt to feel something, anything, other than the cold, creeping grip of death. An outlaw with a heavy bounty on his head did not live a life of glory or admiration. He sat trembling in the darkest corner of a filthy room, his lungs burning with the thick smell of stale smoke and unwashed bodies, his sweaty hand nervously resting on the cold steel of his six-shooter. He watched every single shadow move, analyzed every heavy footstep on the creaking porch, entirely consumed by a paranoid madness that slowly fractured his mind. The wealth he had brutally killed for was a terrible curse that chained him to these rotting, godforsaken outposts. He was a dead man walking, his physical body slowly decomposing in the harsh frontier while his heart was still frantically beating in his chest, waiting for the inevitable moment when his luck would finally, violently run out. If it were you, you would not survive 24 hours in the lawless territory, knowing that your own shadow could betray you for a heavy bag of blood-stained gold. The romanticized idea of a loyal brotherhood of outlaws, standing shoulder to shoulder against a corrupt system, is a beautiful lie constructed by cheap dime novels. The chilling reality was a desolate world, completely devoid of loyalty, where human life was commodified, hid, and sold to the highest bidder. Once that terrifying poster bearing the words "dead or alive" was nailed to a wooden saloon post, you immediately ceased to be a human being. You became a walking currency. And make no mistake about the fatal wording of that decree. Dead or alive was merely a polite legal formality. The ruthless men who hunted you always, without a single exception, preferred the dead option. It is a grim, logistical fact of the brutal frontier that strapping a bleeding, lifeless corpse across the back of a horse for a long trek across the scorching desert is infinitely easier than transporting a desperate, heavily armed prisoner who will fight like a rabid beast for his freedom. Enter the absolute worst nightmare of the wanted man. The bounty hunters and the merciless operatives of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. These were not the noble, square-jawed lawmen of Hollywood legends, proudly pinning on a shiny tin star to uphold justice and protect the innocent. They were state-sanctioned assassins, cold-blooded killers who hunted human prey with the terrifying, relentless efficiency of a starving wolf pack. They did not care about your tragic backstory, the corrupt railroad barons who stole your land, or the starving family that drove you to pick up a Winchester rifle in the first place. To them, you were simply a rotting meat sack holding their next paycheck. They tracked you relentlessly through the muddy, feces-ridden sewers of border towns, across the blistering, unforgiving desert sands, and into the deepest, darkest canyons where the sun never reached. They utilized brutal, horrific interrogation tactics, tortured your associates, and burned down the homes of anyone even suspected of giving you a single night of shelter. The frontier justice they delivered was swift, bloody, and entirely devoid of human mercy. Imagine the absolute, crushing psychological horror of being relentlessly hunted by these invisible executioners. It was a slow, agonizing descent into total, incurable madness. The severe sleep deprivation alone was enough to completely shatter your mind. You could not close your eyes for more than a few fleeting minutes without being violently jolted awake by a terrifying hallucination of a Pinkerton agent stepping out of the shadows, his cold eyes staring down the barrel of a six-shooter aimed squarely at your skull. Your physical body was utterly exhausted, running on the fading fumes of pure adrenaline and the cheap, poisonous whiskey you swallowed to numb the terror. The paranoia became a literal physical sickness, a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on your chest, making it impossible to breathe the dusty air. You analyzed every broken twig, every footprint in the mud, and every distant howl of a coyote, convinced it was the sound of your impending doom. But the most terrifying aspect of the outlaw life was not the shadowy bounty hunters tracking you from a distance. It was the crushing, heartbreaking realization that the greatest threat to your survival was sitting right next to you at the flickering campfire. The immense, suffocating pressure of the hunt violently shattered any fragile bonds of loyalty within an outlaw gang. When the stolen food ran out, when the horses collapsed and died from sheer exhaustion, and when the heavily armed posse was closing in, the primal, brutal instinct to survive completely took over. You looked into the eyes of the man you called your brother, the man you had bled with and killed with in the dark alleys, and you saw the chilling, unmistakable glimmer of absolute greed. You knew, deep in your rotting, condemned soul, that he was silently calculating the exact price on your head. He was just waiting for you to fall asleep, waiting for that one single, fatal moment of weakness, to draw his weapon and tear your throat open to claim the reward. You were completely surrounded by heavily armed enemies. The rigid law wanted you dragged to the gallows and publicly hanged. The bloodthirsty bounty hunters wanted your corpse to trade for silver. And your own desperate friends were waiting to slit your throat in the pitch-black night. Every rustling leaf in the dead of night was a deafening alarm bell. You lived in a constant, paralyzing state of heart-pounding terror, your sanity slowly crumbling to dust as you realized there was absolutely nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. You were permanently trapped in a massive, open-air dungeon, just waiting for the inevitable, violent moment when the lead bullet would shatter your spine, and the darkness would finally, mercifully swallow you whole. The boundary between friend and foe was entirely extinguished by the overwhelming, bloodthirsty greed of the wild frontier, leaving you to die alone in the dirt. This is not a heroic fairy tale where the brave protagonist casually bandages a minor flesh wound with a clean strip of torn linen, grits his teeth, and valiantly rides back into the chaotic fray. In the merciless, blood-soaked reality of the Wild West, the heavy lead bullet fired from a Colt 45 was rarely the fastest thing to kill you. It was merely the agonizing opening act of your slow, gruesome demise. The cinematic illusion completely erases the horrifying medical reality of the 19th century frontier. If you were unlucky enough to catch a bullet in the gut during a cowardly ambush, you did not die instantly in a blaze of glory. You fell into the muddy, feces-stained dirt, clutching your shattered stomach, and began a terrifying descent into a literal hell of physical decay. There were no modern hospitals, no sterile operating rooms, and absolutely no antibiotics to save your miserable life. A gunshot wound in the lawless territory was an absolute, unbreakable death sentence, delivered through days or even weeks of unbearable, suffocating agony. When a heavy, unjacketed lead bullet tore through human flesh, it did not create a clean, surgical hole. It flattened and fragmented upon impact, violently shattering solid bone into dozens of jagged shrapnel pieces and dragging filthy, sweat-soaked clothing deep into the gaping wound cavity. From that exact moment, a ticking clock of horrific infection began. You would lie trembling in a dark, suffocating hideout, or on the filthy floor of a stinking saloon, feeling the intense, burning fever completely consume your body. The lack of basic hygiene meant that microscopic monsters were already devouring you from the inside out. Tetanus, commonly known as lockjaw, would violently seize your nervous system. Your muscles would painfully spasm and lock so tightly that your teeth would shatter under the immense pressure, leaving you completely unable to swallow even a single drop of dirty water. You would literally choke on your own thick saliva, trapped in a paralyzed, sweating body. But the true, absolute nightmare of the frontier outlaw was the slow, creeping terror of gangrene. Without any medical intervention to clean the massive internal damage, the torn flesh around the bullet hole would begin to die and rapidly decompose while you were still perfectly conscious. Imagine the bone-chilling horror of looking down at your own body and seeing the skin slowly turn a sickly, bruised purple, and then a pitch dead black. Imagine the psychological torture of smelling the foul, putrid stench of your own rotting meat filling the cramped, airless room. You were literally becoming a rotting corpse while your heart was still frantically beating in your chest. The dark, thick blood that oozed from the festering wound was a grim reminder that your physical form was entirely giving up the desperate fight for survival. If by some dark miracle you managed to find a frontier doctor, your nightmare was only just beginning. These medical practitioners were often nothing more than glorified butchers, operating in dark, dusty back rooms with tools that had never seen a drop of boiling water. There was absolutely no anesthesia to shield your fragile mind from the trauma. If a bullet shattered your arm or your leg, the only brutal cure for the spreading, black gangrene was immediate, merciless amputation. You would be forcefully pinned down onto a blood-stained wooden table by heavy hands. The doctor would hand you a piece of dirty leather to bite down on, perhaps pour a splash of cheap, poisonous whiskey down your burning throat. and then he would pick up a heavy, rust-stained bone saw. The ensuing auditory horror is something Hollywood absolutely refuses to show you. You would be fully awake, completely trapped in your own personal nightmare. As you felt the cold, jagged metal teeth of the saw violently rip through your living skin, tear apart your strong muscles, and loudly grind against your solid bones. The deafening, blood-curdling screams of grown men enduring this primitive butchery would echo through the empty frontier nights, a chilling symphony of human despair. The sheer, overwhelming shock of the excruciating pain was often enough to stop a human heart entirely. And if you somehow survived the brutal chopping block, you were left as a crippled, broken phantom. You had survived the rain of hot lead and the heavily armed posse, only to find yourself transformed into a helpless, rotting invalid in a savage land that showed absolutely no mercy to the weak. This was the ultimate, tragic humiliation of the outlaw life. You fought with ruthless brutality to remain a free man, only to end up weeping in the suffocating darkness, desperately begging your own criminal brothers to put a final, merciful bullet in your skull just to end the relentless, agonizing torture of your own rotting, decaying flesh. Every bloody play must eventually lower its curtain, but the final act of a frontier outlaw is never a peaceful drift into the eternal sleep. It is the ultimate public humiliation on a rotting wooden scaffold. If you think the justice system of the Wild West offered a quick and honorable death, you are entirely wrong. The reality of a public hanging was a grotesque carnival of human suffering, a brutal spectacle designed to strike absolute terror into the hearts of anyone who dared to defy the law. You would not face a firing squad of honorable soldiers. You would be dragged from your dark, filthy cell, your hands tightly bound behind your back, forced to walk the agonizing path toward a hastily constructed gallows. The psychological torture of those final 24 hours is impossible to fully comprehend. You sit alone in the pitch-black dungeon listening to the deafening rhythmic sound of a heavy iron hammer driving nails into thick wooden planks. Every single strike is a violent countdown to your own execution. The townspeople are gathering outside, pitching tents and drinking cheap whiskey, treating your impending doom as a festive holiday. The noise of their cruel laughter echoes through the cold stone walls, a sickening reminder that your agonizing death is merely cheap entertainment for the civilized world. When the terrifying morning finally arrives, the heavy iron door swings open and the merciless executioner steps into the light. He does not offer comfort or salvation. He simply grabs your trembling arm and violently pulls you toward the sunlight. As you walk up those 13 wooden steps, your legs completely give out, paralyzed by a primal, overwhelming fear. You look out over the sea of faces and you see absolutely no mercy, only cold, bloodthirsty anticipation. And then the thick, rough hemp rope is violently slipped over your head. The cinematic myth tells you that the drop is quick, that the neck snaps instantly, and the pain is over in a single merciful second. The horrifying historical truth is that the frontier executioners were often drunk, incompetent butchers. The drop was rarely calculated correctly. When the wooden trapdoor violently swings open beneath your feet, you do not die instantly. The fall is just short enough to leave your neck perfectly intact, but long enough to violently jerk your body to a sudden, agonizing halt. You are left dangling in the thin, dusty air, fighting a terrifying, losing battle for a single breath of oxygen. The heavy knot of the rough rope viciously crushes your windpipe and tears into your soft flesh. Your face turns a horrifying shade of dark purple, your eyes violently bulge from their sockets, and your limbs thrash wildly in a desperate primal panic. You are slowly, painfully being strangled to death. This agonizing suffocation can last for 10 to 20 excruciating minutes while the crowd cheers and the merciless frontier sun beats down on your twitching, dying body. You feel every single agonizing second of your own demise, your mind screaming in absolute terror until the heavy darkness finally completely swallows your consciousness. This is the true, brutal legacy of the lawless territory. The romanticized outlaws of the dime novels did not die as legendary heroes. They died as broken, terrified animals, their bodies left to violently rot in the scorching sun before being unceremoniously dumped into a shallow, unmarked grave in the barren desert dirt. Their names were quickly forgotten, swallowed by the harsh, unforgiving wind of the wild frontier. Do not let the shiny Hollywood movies lie to you. The Wild West was a terrifying meat grinder, a living hell that devoured human souls and painted the dusty landscape with thick, dark blood. If you managed to survive the cowardly ambushes, the flesh-eating diseases, and the merciless bounty hunters, the hangman was always patiently waiting at the end of the dusty trail to violently extinguish your miserable life. The illusion of freedom was the deadliest trap of all. If you want to uncover more horrifying truths that history desperately tried to bury deep in the dirt, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below telling us what terrified you the most. And be warned, you will not want to miss our next descent into the darkness. We will completely expose the terrifying absolute nightmare of the gold rush, where the glittering promise of wealth led thousands of innocent men into the pitch-black, suffocating depths of the haunted underground mines, never to see the light of day again.